webinar in our Screen Forever Market webinar series. My name is Jessica Giaco. I'm the Industry Programs Manager at Screen Producers Australia. I'd just like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the lands on which we live and work, and for me that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So I'm delighted to welcome you all to our first in a series of webinars talking with key international executives who will be attending Screen Forever this year. So as a way to find out about what projects they will be looking for, as well as some thoughts on the state of the industry from their part of the world, we'll just do a little deep dive into all of that with them. And the first in our series is Todd Brown, the Head of International Acquisitions at XYZ Films. Welcome, Todd.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you. So just before we get started, any questions, please pop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and I will get to them as we go as well. So Todd, can you just start by telling us a little bit about your role at XYZ Films? Where
Sure.
are you based and what regions you cover?
Sure. The company is LA based, was founded in 2008 as a production company and then quickly expanded into quite a number of other things. I joined about 6 months in, so I'm not one of the founders, but have been there almost right from the very beginning. I personally am Canadian and have always been based in Canada. So right now I'm in a city called Hamilton, which is just to the west of Toronto. So in Ontario, for those who know the country at all. And my basic role, I'm reading and looking for new talent literally all the time. I think my script list right now is about 15 or 20 scripts deep. I had a bunch come in today. I was almost caught up quite recently, and I no longer am. And territory-wise, region-wise, we're not super rigid about things. But in general, um, my I'm generally the first point of contact for anything that is not American,
Mhm.
kind of within the group. Part of the theory is that the founders of the company, Nick, Nate, and Aram, they all met doing the UCLA Producers Program. I come from a very different background. And so my theory has always been I'm not going to catch up to them and their base of relationships anyway. Um, I'm definitely not frozen out of meeting at the American projects and talking to the American projects, but my principal area is all of the stuff that is not them.
Okay, great. So that includes Australia specifically. Can you tell
Absolutely.
us a little bit about how you currently work with Australian producers, any projects you might be working on currently?
Sure. We have the ability to work together in a lot of different ways, because we have kind of multiple sales arms within the company. We do have a financial fund backing us. We're backed by a venture capital firm, and that money, um, we have, a threshold that we have to cross in terms of the model to say to them, here's what it is and here's why it's worthwhile. Once we have crossed that threshold, that money is actually quite flexible in how it can deploy. It can be equity, it can be gap, it can be MG. They give us a lot of room for how we can kind of enter into a project. And most recently, within the life of the company, we also launched American distribution. So we have the ability to directly distribute in the United States, although it is not in any way linked to the sales and finance arm. There's no expectation that because we are selling something or financing it, that we are going to distribute it.
Mhm.
Those they operate somewhat independently of each other. Everybody on every team knows what everybody else is doing,
Mhm.
but you always have to make the argument that that's actually the best thing. Right now, as an example, we're working with Carver Films on Natalie Erica James' new project. So Carver, very typical Australian kind of production finance model on that. This is Natalie's third feature, her second one within the Australian system. She stepped away, did a studio film before coming back for this one. Um, and they pieced together kind of what the model would look like, what the Screen Australia kind of support would be, did those applications. We stepped in and filled in the remaining kind of gap in the finances. And we are selling the world minus Australia, New Zealand. which, as is typically done, was pre-sold as part of the financing package.
Mhm.
Um, I would actually need to double check what exactly our money is structured as in that one.
Yep.
I believe it's an MG. It might actually be a production loan. Um,
Okay. But you're distributing as well.
no, we're selling
You're selling.
on
I
that.
okay.
Yeah.
So and so there's two different, so it doesn't automatically mean you get distribution, as you said, if you come in for a production
Yeah,
fund.
we
Yeah.
try to make that decision really early, which kind of
Yeah.
part of the company and which model we're working in. And if we
Mm,
make the decision early on that we are going to finance and sell, then certainly the sales arm has their chance to offer on it and
mm,
make an argument. But they are effectively at that point, they are one buyer of many, and
okay.
they would have to make the argument. And honestly, one of the things that makes it very, very clear that those lines are separate is like the money behind our distribution arm is actually different money than the money behind the finance arm.
Okay.
So we can't self-deal. I mean, ethically, you couldn't do that anyway. We have a fiduciary responsibility to the producers that we're working with and to the financiers that are in, that we have to generate the best financial life for a film. We could never just say, we're going to give it to ourselves.
Mhm.
We really can't do that because it's like behind the scenes, it's completely different people. If we ever did that, one of them would be suing the other one.
Mhm.
Um, so it's a pretty clear, sharp line.
Okay. Okay, great. So I guess that sort of makes me think to ask when someone comes to you with a project, what do they need to come to you with? Would you want to come at an early stage of development? What would you be looking for?
Most typically when we look, we like to be in relatively early.
Mm,
Like as I said, I'm kind of tracking directing talent all the time. I'm reading scripts all the time. For us to formally engage and run the evaluation and answer the questions that our backers are going to ask us, we would need to have a script, a budget, a finance plan,
mhm.
for sure.
Okay.
And then depending what it is, a certain amount of packaging, like to
Mm,
to have a sense of kind of the bigger the gap is, the more important casting to a certain level is. And depending on what our role is, that can change as well. We are on many projects pretty actively hands-on in the casting process. Sometimes we're not, so that can slide. But
mm,
as a base level, we need those three things to be able to run our model and to make a formal offer and a formal proposal.
mhm.
Um, it is, we're reading things that are earlier than that all the time. Um, yeah,
Sorry.
and then just kind of tracking and keeping in touch as they go through, as
Okay,
as
great.
as things come together.
So those three things, the script, the budget, and the finance plan, they're essentially the three items you're looking for, plus
Yeah.
some packaging. So maybe if they came to you with a great writer, the writer essentially who written the script, or if there's like,
Yeah, or a director on it, that's somebody
yeah,
that's really kind of interesting and exciting. And then, as you sit down and you look at, okay, what is the finance plan? What is the model on how this thing's going to get paid for? When we're looking at those things, obviously gross budget matters. It's a question that we ask, but the real impact of that, the interest in that is just is that going to give you the resources to make the thing that you want to make? And
mm,
with terms of our own financial model, the number that really, really matters is the gap number,
okay.
and what needs to be filled out of the marketplace. And once you identify what that number is, that has a really direct impact on what sort of scale of cast you're going to need to justify filling the gap.
Mhm. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions coming in here, and I guess this question I think is directly related to pitching, and I want to sort of switch this to Screen Forever a little bit here. So if someone sort of
Yeah.
sets up a meeting with you at Screen Forever and they come and sit down with you, they've got 15 minutes, whatever it is they've got in with you. What do you expect to see? And the question here is, what does the packaging in a pitch include? If they can't sort of,
Um,
yeah.
pitching is kind of it. There's a lot of different ways of answering to that question, because I think you're gonna adapt what you're doing in a pitch to who your audience is
Mhm.
all the time.
Mm.
Um, And I say a lot, like I used to help run a co-production market, and when we did a lot of kind of pitch work and kind of training and prep work ahead of time. And one of the points I make all the time is when you're pitching something is within the pitch itself, I am at least as much looking at, assuming it's like the director that's talking, um, I'm looking at you as a storyteller.
Hmm.
And what is the hook of the story? First of all, what is the thing there? Is it engaging? But how do you tell it? And are you actually kind of engaging in that moment, um, and in that conversation? Um, the things that I'm really looking for, I think, a lot of writers, a lot of young, particularly younger writers, younger producers, tend to get really, really hung up on the idea of originality, and everything has to be a brand new thing.
Hmm.
And there is some certain aspects of that that are true. There are times where you see waves of certain things because they're in the zeitgeist. And so you see a
Mm.
lot of naturally competitive projects that are all in the same space. And realistically, only a certain number of those are going to survive. And so you have to get really hyper selective when that happens. But I am one of those people who believes, there's different literary theories about how many stories actually exist in the world. The number is very small. I think one of them is five, one of them is seven. Um, I'm I don't care about it to the point that I would put a number on it, but the number is small. And everything fundamentally has been told in some way before. And so the bigger question to me is always, why is this story yours? Why is there urgency to it? What is your POV on it that's going to drive it forward and make it compelling to an audience? That's always to me the biggest thing in a pitch. When you're actually pitching, I mean, you need to be prepared for people to ask you the budget question. You need to be prepared for people to ask you how you're going to approach things practically. Um, for me personally, I think if you're actively pitching those things when you have a narrow window of time, you're doing it wrong. When you see people walk into a presentation and they throw up like a budget sheet, yeah, don't do that.
No, okay.
Nobody's going to read it off of that. Like if somebody says to you, how much do you need to be able to answer that question.
Yeah.
But nobody's going to sit down and make a financial decision in the moment as you're going through a spreadsheet, which is an incredibly boring thing to do in any context. Um, and so that's kind of the biggest thing. And then once we're interested in somebody and you look at somebody and say, okay, you're a really interesting creator, you're an interesting storyteller, then we'll do the deeper dive into,
Mm.
okay, what is the underlying math? What is the business? But that follows after the pitch. The pitch is about hooking the attention in the first place.
And that could be like a Screen Forever. It's likely going to be a lot of producers
Yeah.
pitching as well, over directors. We actually have there's another question here from Sarah. How do you get a budget and finance plan coming from a screenwriter? How would you take the next steps? Um,
As a writer, you've got a script that you really believe in. Next step, 100% is go out and find a really good producer on it. Somebody that's in that space what you want to be really realistic about the scale of what the story is that you're telling. You want to have somebody who's at an appropriate position of their career, somebody who's kind of been down this road before, and that person is going to sit down and break down kind of the actual physical production elements, break down a physical budget, sit down, know what all the regional kind of incentives, the tax credits, the rebate, the offset, what reasonably could or could not be expected to come from Screen Oz, what could or could not reasonably be expected to come from the local state funds, and work out, okay, here's what the script is, here are the physical demands of making it. That translates into this number as a gross budget, the actual physical cost of making it from top to bottom. And that translates into this net budget once you take out what the government will put in. That is a huge part of the producer's job.
Yeah, that's really great. And look, Sarah, I would also suggest if you come to Screen Forever, it's a great place to find a producer as well, to collaborate with. Just another question here, but just before I get to that, I just want to ask, what is a realistic budget for you to consider for a feature?
We don't have a really rigid kind of parameters on that, I would say. And there's zones that are worrying
Mm.
for different reasons that will kind of raise flags and lead to some hard questions. There's zones that are increasingly getting squeezed out by just kind of market realities of who is buying and what they're willing to spend. Um, and the answer to that question, again, can be really different if you're talking about, say, an American budget versus a Canadian budget versus a French budget versus like an Australian budget, because of what the government can bring in. Again, the number that ultimately is going to squeeze you is the gap number more than the gross budget, right? Like in an Australian context, it is not uncommon at all if you're at about, call it about an $8 million Australian dollar budget, and you get investment from Screen Australia and you get investment from your state fund and you get your offset at the full value, that budget probably is going to be somewhere between 65 and 70% filled just from, Australian incentives and your Australia, New Zealand distribution advance. Where in the American context, if you're doing an American film, if you shoot it in a tax credit state, at the absolute best case situation, you're going to be, 80% coming out of the market. That's going to just have to be hard market capital, which means there's a lot more at risk. So they'll give you very, very different answers, depending on what you can draw from different places. We are very commonly, I would say these days, most commonly working on films ranging between, call it 4 and 12 gross USD. Once you drop below that number, it becomes a real question about, okay, well, how are you physically going to execute? And how are you going to afford the kind of cast that buyers are insisting on? Because that window is getting aggressively harder. Distributor expectations for cast right now are the most demanding, the most conservative that we've ever seen by like a lot, in terms of establishing what a baseline is. And there's a long-winded explanation for why that is.
I would actually like
and then
to.
when you get above that, it's like you end up getting into, there are certain zones where you end up in these nether regions. It used to be kind of like 10 years ago, 12 years ago, you would talk about, the value would be, it was almost like analog. It was on a bit of a sliding scale and things would move up and down and you could kind of find the appropriate position. And it's not that anymore. In the buying community, it's become really digital. And things have really rigid slots. And if you end up with kind of a budget and kind of that market need falling in between positions, it's not like you split the difference and things work. More often you just drop into this nether zone where people don't know how to make sense. They don't know how to release it at the higher level and support it. And they can't afford it at the lower level. And so rather than saying, okay, we'll try to figure out something in between, it just turns into, we just won't do it.
Okay.
Right. And so there's certain things like that are tricky.
Just a couple of questions coming in about what genre and type of content you're looking
Sure.
for.
Yeah, we as a company have always been pretty highly focused on what we would describe as kind of very high-end theatrical and kind of festival grade genre film. I will say we have a broader understanding of what we mean by genre than most people. A lot of the time when you say that you're a genre company, people assume you're a horror company. We definitely do a certain number of horror films. But we are not a horror company the way that like Blumhouse is a horror company who basically only does horror. We do a lot of thrillers. Science fiction consistently works really, really well. Action films historically have been very good for us. It's a space that we spend a lot of time and we really enjoy. They're a lot of fun to work with. And the rationale is pretty simple. You have a really motivated audience there. And I think in the right hands with really kind of strong directing and writing talent, working in genres really versatile. I mean, genres generally like they play to certain kind of allegorical realities. They are about other things. So you can get into some really meaty subjects while doing it in a way that's really accessible. And that's exciting to us. I would say over the last year, market reality has really pushed us into a zone where we are definitely being a lot more deliberate about limiting ourselves to films that have clear theatrical releasing potential across multiple major territories. We used to do a lot more stuff that was would do like kind of day and date targeted like super limited specialty theatrical, but really the business was home entertainment oriented. That zone is becoming very dangerous, bluntly, in terms of protecting an investment. And so I mean, there might be the occasional exception here and there, but mostly there is a lot of conversation about, okay, let's skew theatrical. And that's why, like I mentioned, like we're working with Natalie James right now. Natalie is clearly a theatrically oriented director. That's been her whole history, or out of like an Australian context right now. And it's tricky to say why certain of these were ended up being theatrical where other ones didn't off of the pitch. But there's a big bidding fight on the Michael Shanks film at Sundance right now, like a big one from what we're hearing. We're not involved in that film, but it is going to sell
Brilliant.
large.
Yeah, yeah.
Like the Philippou brothers and Talk to Me. And I mean, Causeway's whole history is very
Yeah.
theatrically oriented. They've definitely had films that have released in other models, but the intention is always there.
Mm.
And the execution is always to that level. So like those are lines that we're looking at, and it's slippery and hard to define kind of where the line is between something that's theatrical versus something that's home end sometimes. Um, but it is definitely a thing that we're becoming a lot more deliberate about.
Right. And I think that answers a question from Cecilia whether this means theatrical cinema is coming back, whether the demand is coming back. I would like to say yes to that, that the demand for theatrical is coming back.
It's an interesting moment. I mean, I would love it if it were a clear, easy, obvious yes. I don't know that that's the case. I do think we're seeing something that's really analogous to what the music industry was in like the early 90s, where at one point in the 90s, something like 85 or 90% of all media, all music globally, at some point was flowing through one of five companies.
Mhm.
Which creates obvious problems to it. And that is absolutely happening now. When you look at the underlying economics of the industry, whether you are commissioned by a streamer or not, the reality is that the stable money that the theatrical buyers have been basing their projections on for years, ever since the collapse of home video, has been on the cable TV sale, on the broadcast rights sale. And these days, that increasingly means the streamers. There are fewer and fewer players in the space that are non-streamers. So streamer appetite is having a really outsized impact on what is working, what is not working, and to what level. So this last, I mean, we're coming out of it now, but like the last kind of year and a half of streamer contraction has had dramatic impacts on the theatrical marketplace. One of the definite consequences of that, though, certainly within kind of the genre world, and you're seeing it in other things, like I'm really curious to see how The Brutalist does long term theatrically,
That
especially
looks
because I mean, that's a
fantastic.
4 hour movie.
I just
Logistically,
saw it
that's a
on the weekend.
phenomenally difficult movie to release.
Yeah.
Um, but it has created, I think, undeniably underserviced audiences that want communal experiences. And the question is going to be, how do people leverage that and take advantage of it?
Mm.
And I think we are starting to see, certainly in America, I don't know how much this carries over to Oz, but you're seeing certain distributors that are being very smart about actually shifting the way they are releasing things. Actually, an Australian example in America, one of the first ones where people really, really noticed this, Late Night with the Devil, the Cairns Brothers film.
Mm.
IFC put that film out. And, 5 years ago, well, not even 5 years ago, 2 years ago, the wisdom would have been you put that movie out on maybe 75 screens and you try to kind of word of mouth it and you try to capture the revenue off of kind of premium VOD and transactional revenue and people doing iTunes rentals and things like that. And that's how you do that movie because it's not really casty. It's got an interesting conceptual hook. And what IFC recognized was that specific film was executed to a very high level, and that specific film appeals to an audience that had been neglected.
Very low
And what
budget.
they And
Surprising.
what they quietly
Yeah.
did as a distributor is they just started grabbing as talking to exhibitors about screen space availability. They just very quietly just kept accumulating screen bookings. And by the time they put that film out, I believe the final count, the peak count in the United States was somewhere between 1,000 and 1,400 screens. And they definitely spent some P&A. Like, I mean, they took a risk in their advertising, but they spent it incredibly wisely rather than trying to advertise to the mass. Like normally, if you're going to put a movie out kind of historically on like 1,000 screens, 1,400 screens, 1,500 screens, you're going to spend about 10 or $15 million in marketing on that because the assumption is, we need wide mass appeal. This has to work for everybody to be on those number of screens. And IFC's approach was no, this is going to appeal to a very specific audience. And maybe that audience only fills those screens over the span of a week and then the screens go away. But we're going to market only to that audience. And it's going to be enough that we're going to create this other word of mouth. It's going to create notice. It's going to create hype and conversation that will then drive value in those other windows. Um, and in their case, it held for multiple weeks. I don't know exactly how much they spent in their marketing. It was in the seven figures, but it was in the low seven figures. And a lot of digital, a lot of stuff really targeting really specific age groups, heavily geo-targeted around the zones where those screens physically were. Um, and it completely worked. And then they duplicated it, a month later with a tiny Canadian horror film, which again was not cast driven in any way, called In a Violent Nature. Um, you know, did it again, worked really well. About a month after that, a new distribution company in the United States did the exact same model again with a movie called Strange Harvest. Um, and you're seeing if you know your audience, if you know who you have made it for, and you
Mm.
can figure out how to speak directly to that audience, yeah, they're coming back.
Absolutely. I
Um,
think
yeah.
I feel like we could talk all afternoon about this, and I feel like this is something we're going to have to extend at Screen Forever and talk more about audience and marketing and distribution. So keep your eyes out for the program, people. But I think we'll just bring it back to Screen Forever quickly. Couple more questions in here. Like, what materials should we prepare for our pitch? So, should we have some pages of our script ready, a PowerPoint, a one-page summary? That's if they're
I
pitching.
would say I would say not the script. I would
Yep.
say a really good visual pitch deck is great. A
Mhm.
good visual deck that kind of walks through kind of you know a one or two sentence log line,
Yeah.
a little bit of a character breakdown. Here's a visual tone of the piece. I would say people have differing opinions of reels and how well they work.
Mm.
Um, in most cases, I would say if you are making a pitch reel out of other people's footage, I'm not personally all that interested in that. All what you're showing me with that is that you like someone else's stuff and what other films you like. I'll get that just as easily off of images and comps. Um,
What about
I
AI
will
reels?
say, however, yeah, it depends what you're doing with it.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, if you have the ability to do a proof of concept or if something is being kind of, it's like there's been a short film that is now being expanded into a feature. A good proof of concept reel or a scene or something like that, that is the single most powerful pitch material that there is. 100% there is because that's actually you.
Mm.
The one exception I would make to that, I did see a rip reel, it was years ago now, that I absolutely loved. And for those not familiar, a rip reel is it's literally somebody has ripped footage from other stuff and put it together. So they call it a rip. Um, the best one I ever saw was for a Norwegian werewolf movie. Um, and the writer director of that film already knew who his lead actor was and was going to be. And that guy is in all of Joachim Trier's films,
Wow.
which are very much not werewolf movies.
Mm.
And that's part of what made this work so beautifully is he went back and he found footage of the actor he wanted from these really high-end art house films and then turned them into something completely different. And
Mm.
it worked really well. But what it was also saying to people is, oh, like this is not a greatest hits reel of here's some stuff I like. This is actually saying something to me about your skill as a storyteller. Because it's like, as much as I love genre film, I also do really love Scandinavian art house films. And I love Joachim Trier's films. So it's like every piece of footage that was in that was something that for me was really resonant and that I recognized and I could understand, what Trier's intentions were versus what Patrick was doing to it.
Mm.
And so to me, that was making a really strong argument about his ability as a storyteller, where it's like, look, I'm gonna you can give me whatever raw material you want, and
Mm.
I can do this with it. Um, so that was really effective.
But not necessarily a pictorial unless you've got a great one like that at Screen
Yeah.
Forever. But it'd be essentially like a verbal pitch is what you would look for, responding to those questions
Yeah,
that
and when people reach out, kind of
yeah,
like if it's kind of an early introduction thing, if somebody's got like a 10-15 page kind of visual deck as a PDF, that is I without fail, that is the first thing that I look at before I read the script every
okay.
single time.
Okay, great. So a couple of other questions here. One is from Nicholas. What is XYZ's approach, your advice to films, specifically micro-budget films that are searching for sales agents? So they're finished and have already completed post-production. So if you've got a finished film, you're looking for a distributor or a sales agent.
Anything that's micro budget right now is your success in the market is going to have an awful lot to do with kind of what happens in festivals.
Mhm.
So I think that is a thing that you want to explore. You should definitely be talking to sales reps through that in terms of kind of can they help you, can they not help you? And you definitely, if you secure a festival, if you're successful in securing a high level festival, you need to find your representation before premiere. Um, I would say for a seller to really do their job well, and this is a line that is quite a hard, rigid line for us. Um, we believe really strongly, at minimum, to do our job well, we need to be doing at least 6 to 8 weeks of prep work before the film premieres. We have never in the history of the company taken on a film after premiere. And so like always, inevitably every year, I'll get a certain number of emails where somebody's like, hey, I made this tiny little indie, and it turned out really great. And we've played this many festivals, and here's a bunch of positive press. Would you be interested in looking at it? Is there anything you can do with it? And unfortunately, the answer every single time is no.
Okay.
Um, because you can't leverage, like, you're only kind of the new thing that's catching people's attention once. You're only news once.
Mm.
And if you haven't leveraged it, then the nature of the industry is just that there's so much volume all the time. There's so much noise all the time. You literally have a market cycle. If what you're doing is trying to sell a thing purely off of this is just really good and interesting, but
Mm.
there aren't famous people in it.
Okay.
If you don't have that to fall back on, like you really have to capitalize in the moment. Um,
Just conscious
and
for
beyond that, play personal connections all you can. Have people make introductions. Certainly, if kind of you're an indie and you've worked in micro budget, vet people out big time. Anybody that you're talking to, look up their past work, find those producers, talk to them about what their experiences were, talk to them about how they were treated, find out whether reporting is honest, um, kind of what the numbers are. You need to do a lot of research. And if you know people that have worked with people that are good, ask them for the introduction. It totally makes a difference. I mean, I get literally hundreds of emails every day from people reaching out, and if it comes to me from somebody that I already know and that I know is good and is trustworthy, I'm going to read that email first.
Excellent. All right. We have we're a little bit over time. Very quickly, how would you define gap number? I mean, the gap number is the gap in your budget, essentially.
Yeah, it's the thing that is left over. I mean, there's in film finance, people talk about money in two ways. There's hard
Mm.
money, there's soft money. Soft money is basically anything that that either comes automatically from kind of a third party or a government source, or in some cases, it's stuff that comes in and technically it's equity. Um, but it's equity in the sense that there isn't any actual consequence if it doesn't come back. Like you're not going to get sued. So like a tax rebate, like the offset, the producer offset in Australia, absolutely soft dollar every time. Screen Australia comes in under 500,000, that's grant money, completely pure soft dollar. Screen Australia comes in more than that. Technically, it is equity, but it's the softest possible kind of equity. They would like to recoup, but if they don't recoup, nobody's coming and knocking on your door in the middle of the night. So we would take all of those things and we consider those soft money, and you kind of apply those against your gross budget, remove all of those things. Whatever is left is hard capital investment of some sort that needs to come from somebody who is literally just writing you a check and counting on making it back plus a profit. That's the gap number.
That's
It's
a great.
whatever is left.
Thank you so much, Todd. We're over time, so we are going to have to leave it there. So, for all of our viewers, you can submit your project via our portal on the screenforever.org.au website. Go to the SPA Connect pages, and you can have a look at all the information there on how to submit to the market and set your meetings. Thank you, Todd, so much. Look forward to seeing you in May at Screen Forever, May 6th to 8th of May. I just said on the Gold
Yep.
Coast. We'll see you there. All right. Thanks, Todd.
All right. Thanks so
All
much for
right.
having me.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone. Thank you.